The stretch of coastline from Tillamook Bay in Oregon to the northern tip of Vancouver Island is known as the Graveyard of the Pacific. This deadly reputation started as soon as European explorers began widely navigating the area in the 18th century. Violent currents, treacherous coastlines, and notoriously unpredictable weather make this one of the deadliest stretches of coastline in the world. The tragedies of the past remain close to mariners in the area, but one of these tragedies, the wreck of the SS Valencia, stands out from countless other disasters. The horrific death of her passengers and crew lingers in the fog, haunting the area to this day. In 1839, the Red D Line began operating a shipping service between New York and Venezuela. By 1879, the well-established company decided to modernize their fleet and ordered 2 steamships from William Cramp & Sons in Philadelphia. The first of these 2 liners, the Caracas, was completed in 1881, and her sister ship, the Valencia, was completed in 1882. The Valencia was a single-screw steamer with 3 decks and a gross tonnage of 1,598. She was 252 feet long with a beam of 34 feet. She was licensed to carry 286 passengers and was equipped with what was considered adequate safety equipment for the time, including 6 lifeboats, 1 workboat, and 4 life rafts. Her maiden voyage took place in May 1882. The 2 ships would operate together until the Caracas was sold in 1888 to the Oregon Pacific Railroad Company. She would be renamed the Aquina Bay and would ironically run aground in the bay she was renamed after later that year. Not a great sign for moving these ships to the Pacific Northwest. The Valencia would continue with the Red D Line for another decade. In 1897, she was attacked by a Spanish cruiser off Guantanamo Bay for not flying the American flag, but she escaped without any major damage. In 1898, she was sold to the Pacific Steam Whaling Company. She was brought around Cape Horn to the west coast, where she would sail between San Francisco and the territory of Alaska. Later that year, she was briefly chartered by the United States Army during the Spanish-American War. After her return to civilian service, she ran into some legal trouble, due to some light embezzlement, and was sold to the Pacific Coast Steamship Company, where she continued offering passenger voyages between California and Alaska. The Valencia was not a well-loved ship. She was small and slow with a service speed of only 11 knots. She was designed for warmer climates and not well suited to the harsh weather of the Pacific Northwest, making for cold, damp voyages. She was also a bit difficult to operate. Her 100-foot bow was too long and gave her bridge poor visibility, especially in foggy conditions. Waves crashing on her bow were unusually loud to the point where it made communication among crew members difficult. And though she was equipped with the required safety features, she lacked a double bottom and proper hull compartmentalization that could slow flooding in an emergency. She was an unlucky ship and suffered a series of collisions and groundings after 1902. By the winter season of 1905, she spent most of her time docked in San Francisco and was only used as a backup vessel. The Valencia's final voyage came in 1906 when she was pulled to service the San Francisco to Seattle route to replace the SS City of Puebla, while she was undergoing repairs after running aground on the Columbia Bar. Her captain was Oscar Marcus Johnson, a Norwegian man with only 4 years' experience sailing the area. The ship departed San Francisco on January 20th with 9 officers, 56 crew members, and at least 108 passengers. At first, she experienced fair weather, but as she passed Cape Mendocino the next day, conditions deteriorated with strong winds and low visibility. As they proceeded up the coast, the crew relied on a method of navigation called dead reckoning to determine their position. This method used a device towed behind the ship to calculate the distance traveled through water. It requires precise calculations, and factors like wind and currents had to be accurately accounted for. Captain Johnson was said to have had a poor understanding of the complex currents in the area, most notably the Davidson Current, which runs north along the western coast of the United States. These currents were clearly indicated on pilot charts of the North Pacific Ocean, but inexplicably, no such charts were on board the Valencia. This meant Captain Johnson's calculations of the ship's speed were off by 1 to 3 knots. Believing they were several miles south of their actual position, at 9 p.m. on January 22nd, Captain Johnson ordered the ship turned eastward toward the coast to enter the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Heavy rain, wind, and fog led to extremely poor visibility. Captain Johnson ordered constant soundings, a customary practice at the time to pick up the strait. Obtaining a sounding of 60 fathoms at 10 p.m., he changed course, turning slightly west, the usual course taken from the Umatilla lightship to Cape Flattery, a location they were actually several miles north of. As they continued, the soundings grew increasingly shallow. 40 fathoms at 11:15, then 30 fathoms at 11:30. The rapid shallowing should have been a clear warning that something was wrong. By 11:35, Captain Johnson finally caught on that they were not where he thought they were. He changed course once again, but he still had no idea where they were. At 11:45, soundings gave an alarming 24 fathoms. Minutes later, Second Officer Pedersen, who was on the bridge with the captain, spotted a dark object looming dead ahead. No signal came from the lookout, who must have been asleep at the time. Pedersen alerted Captain Johnson, who ordered the wheel hard over, but it was too late. The Valencia violently smashed into an underwater reef just before midnight, 11 miles from Cape Beale on the southwest coast of Vancouver Island. Captain Johnson exclaimed, "My God, where are we?" as his ship ground helplessly into the rocky shoreline. The Valencia immediately began taking on water, reportedly 1 foot every minute. Knowing the ship would soon founder, Captain Johnson ordered her run aground to keep her from fully sinking. She ended up with her stern dug into the rocks and her bow pointing out to sea. Though they were less than 14 to 18 meters from the shore, they could not have beached in a worse area. Lighthouses were established in the area at Cape Beale to the north in 1874 and Carmana Point to the south in 1891. But the stretch between the two lights was still woefully underprotected, and multiple ships wrecked in the desolate area every year. The coastline had no beach, just 30-meter cliffs that jutted directly out of the crashing waves. The Valencia's generator quickly failed, plunging the ship into darkness. She was not equipped with a radio to call for help, and it would be over 15 hours before anyone from the outside world would learn of the disaster. In the moments immediately after the collision, panic and confusion overtook the passengers and crew. Captain Johnson knew that the lifeboats had little chance of safely making it to shore, and it would be safer to remain on the stricken ship until help could arrive or a line could be established to the shore. But inexplicably, he still ordered the lifeboats swung out and lowered to the saloon deck rail, though he explicitly ordered that they not be launched. Panicked passengers rushed to fill the tiny boats. In the chaos, shouts were heard calling on the lifeboats to be launched, and the davit crews, unsure where the orders came from, began launching the boats. All 6 lifeboats were launched within half an hour. 3 of these boats either collapsed or were upended during lowering, throwing around 46 people into the water. All but 1 crewman quickly drowned in the turbulent waters. The other 3 lifeboats successfully launched with another 50 people. 1 quickly disappeared, her fate unknown, and the other 2 capsized in the violent sea. Only 12 men from these boats made it to shore, but 1 man was swept back out to sea after clinging to a rock, and 2 others were forced up the face of a cliff by the rising tide, where they eventually fell to their deaths. The remaining 9 men spent the rest of the night huddled among the rocks. This group would become known as the Bunker Party, led by Frank F. Bunker, who was en route to Seattle to become assistant superintendent of the city's schools. His wife and 2 children were among those lost in the lifeboats. Meanwhile, back on the ship, the initial panic had subsided among the nearly 100 left on board. Captain Johnson fired off rockets in an attempt to signal help, apparently severely injuring his hand in the process. The Valencia was equipped with a Lyle gun, that could shoot a line that could be used to establish a breacher's buoy. In the morning light at approximately 8 a.m., Captain Johnson decided that they would try to launch the last boat so someone could at least get to shore and secure the line. At first, Boatswain Timothy J. McCarthy was the only one willing to brave what had already killed nearly a third of the people on the ship. But finally, 5 more crewmen volunteered. The boat was successfully launched and the men barely survived as they desperately paddled for a safe place to land. They finally made it to shore at around 12:30 p.m., a full 8 miles northwest of the wreck. McCarthy and the other exhausted men attempted to find a path back to the Valencia, but they couldn't find a way through the dense forest. Finally, they found a small, poorly maintained trail on the beach with a sign that read 3 miles to Cape Beale. They hiked to the lighthouse, and the station keeper contacted nearby Bamfield, but news of the wreck had already been received. Unbeknownst to McCarthy and those still trapped on the Valencia, the bunker party climbed the bluffs at daybreak and stumbled upon the Carmana-Cape Beale telegraph line. They followed the telegraph line south through a thick forest until they finally came upon a lineman's shack, where they were able to tap into the line and contact the Carmana Point light station. 15 hours after the wreck, word of what happened finally reached Victoria, British Columbia. 2 Pacific Coast Steamship Company ships, the SS Queen and the SS City of Topeka, were dispatched from Seattle, with the Queen departing first. A Canadian salvage steamer, Salver, and another tugboat, the Tsar, joined the search party. Together with the SS Queen, the 3 ships finally located the Valencia on Wednesday morning. Remember, the Valencia wrecked on Monday evening. But the Queen was too large to get any closer than a mile away from the wreck. By this point, the Valencia was breaking up in the pounding waves, with nearly 100 survivors still clinging to her decks and fixtures. The people on board saw the 3 ships approaching and fired the Lyle gun 3 times to signal the rescuers, as hope swelled that they would soon be saved. The shallow-bottom Tsar was able to get closer to the Valencia, but turned back due to the dangerous conditions. Inexplicably, they reported that they saw no survivors on the wreck, though people were clearly visible even to the SS Queen a mile away. The Tsar and Salver, the 2 vessels capable of getting close to the wreck, made the unthinkable decision to head back to Victoria. Meanwhile, the Queen soon lost sight of the wreck as the weather again began to deteriorate. On board the Valencia, the 2 remaining life rafts were hastily prepared. The first departed with 10 men on board. The captain and remaining crew pleaded with the surviving women to climb on board the second tiny life raft, but the horrors of the previous evening, and maybe the hope that the distant steamship would soon save them, kept the women from taking a chance on the craft. Eventually, it left, loaded with 18 men. The women on board reportedly sang "Nearer My God to Thee" as the rafts desperately paddled for the now out-of-sight steamship. At 11 a.m., the city of Topeka arrived on the scene. Inexplicably, the general manager of the Pacific Coast Steamship Company, James E. Farrow, who was on board the Topeka, ordered the captain of the Queen to return to Victoria and board passengers for her regularly scheduled voyage. As the day went on, the weather worsened, and the Topeka slowly and cautiously patrolled the coast, looking for the wreck. At 1 p.m., she came upon the second life raft with 18 men on board, including Second Officer Pedersen. The men were nearly dead when they were finally rescued. The first life raft was less lucky, drifting 18 miles northwest, past Cape Beale and into the Barkley Sound. They landed on a small island late Wednesday night. 2 men fell overboard and drowned, and 4 died of exposure on the island. The 4 who survived wandered the island all day Thursday until they finally were discovered and rescued. The last hope of rescue for those still on board the Valencia was just as bafflingly pathetic as the rescue ships. Immediately after hearing what was happening on Tuesday afternoon, a group of 3 left Carmana Light to aid in the rescue. They took with them only about 100 feet of rope. On Tuesday night, they set up camp by a river and didn't resume again until 9:30 a.m. Wednesday morning. They then stopped for tea at around noon at a Nuchanoth encampment, only a few miles away from the wreck, while the people still on board watched the 3 rescue ships sail away. That afternoon, they finally reached a bluff and spotted the wreck. They reported that the people saw them and cheered, but unbelievably, no further communication was made, and even more unbelievably, no attempt was made to establish a lifeline between the wreck and the shore. The three men just stood and watched for an hour, bearing witness to the moment when the vessel finally wrecked apart, spilling people into the violent waters. Most still wore their life jackets, and those that weren't smashed on the rocks were carried out to sea by the currents. The rescue party, having rescued nobody, left the bluff while the remaining victims of the Valencia were still clinging to life in the icy sea. None would survive. The ship remained intact for nearly 40 hours after she wrecked, with survivors clinging to her till the end. Bad luck, paired with ineptitude and indifference, doomed the people on board to an agonizing, drawn-out end. Estimates vary, but the official federal report put the death toll at 136 people. Only 37 men lived through the ordeal. Every woman and child on board the Valencia wouldn't survive. Even before the wreck of the Valencia broke up, the press began covering the tragic story. Coverage quickly shifted to outrage as details of the botched rescue efforts came to light. Multiple inquiries were initiated by the United States and Canada, including one personally ordered by President Theodore Roosevelt. They determined that the incident was the result of navigational mistakes and poor weather. The Valencia was equipped with adequate safety equipment, but the crew never carried out a lifeboat drill, no doubt contributing to the disastrous mistakes made launching the lifeboats. And though the inquiries were critical of the failed rescue efforts, they ultimately determined that the rescuers did what they could given the circumstances. The lack of life-saving infrastructure on Vancouver Island came under great scrutiny. Following the report's recommendations, a new lighthouse, Pacina Point, was commissioned and built between Cape Beale and Carmana Point in 1908. They also recommended the creation of a life-saving trail with regularly spaced shelters for shipwrecked sailors. The trail would be completed in 1911 and later became known as the West Coast Trail. Surf boats and additional vessels capable of rescue were also permanently stationed near the area. All of these provisions undoubtedly made the area safer, but the tragic missteps of the SS Valencia would go on to haunt the area for generations. Ghostly sightings of the Valencia started even before the deadly disaster came to an end. While the city of Topeka was on her way back to Seattle with the tiny handful of survivors, the ship briefly paused to relay the details of the tragedy to another passing vessel. A man stood on the ship's stern surveying the dark, misty waters. The horrors that took place only a few miles away were no doubt drifting through his mind. Suddenly, something in the distance caught his eye. There, in the low-hanging smoke that spewed from the Topeka's funnel, he could just barely make out the dark outline of another liner approaching in the distance. He turned to see if anyone on deck could help identify the vessel, but he found no one close. When he looked back, the strange vessel was gone. Soon the city of Topeka was again underway. The man wondered if what he saw was really another ship or just the fog playing tricks on his mind. Then, a commotion on the forward deck grabbed his attention. He ran forward to find the other men on deck pointing to something just off the port bow. His heart stopped when he saw what they were looking at. Running nearly parallel to the city of Topeka was another vessel that seemed to have come out of nowhere. The men on board the Topeka let out a horrified gasp when they drew close enough to make out the lettering on her hull. It was the Valencia, piloted by some unseen force. The Topeka attempted to signal the phantom ship, but just as soon as she appeared, she vanished in the rocks on the shore. 6 months after the disaster, a local Nuchanith fisherman and his wife were exploring the shore of Pacina Bay when they came upon a hidden sea cave obstructed by a large boulder. When they peered inside, they saw a lifeboat with 8 skeletons, trapped floating in the watery darkness below. It's believed that a high tide lifted the small boat into the mouth of the cave, and the heavy seas trapped them inside. Whether what they saw that day was one of Valencia's 6 lifeboats is unknown, but it's hard to believe any remain floating long enough in the stormy sea to make it into the mouth of that cave. The Valencia was also just one of several wrecks in the area around this time. Only a few months earlier, another vessel wrecked in almost the same spot, and a lifeboat involved in the rescue effort also went missing. So it's possible this doomed lifeboat could have actually come from another wreck. The dangerous seas made the cave incredibly difficult to access and made any recovery attempt impossible. But that wasn't the last or even the most amazing sighting involving one of Valencia's lifeboats. In 1933, a derelict lifeboat was found floating in Barkley Sound. When the lifeboat was pulled ashore and examined, the nameplate was still clearly legible. It was the Valencia's No. 5 lifeboat, somehow still in decent condition, 27 years after the disaster. The nameplate can still be found displayed at the Maritime Museum of British Columbia. How the tiny craft survived nearly 3 decades is a complete mystery. These are just some of the strange stories of the Valencia. Apparently, at least for a time, whenever mariners in the area thought they saw a phantom ship in the dark mist, they would always say it was the Valencia, reenacting the deadly night she ran aground. There are even reports of ghostly lifeboats appearing in the distance, only to fade into the mist. Pieces of her wreck are still visible today, but the area remains difficult to access due to the rough terrain. The story of the Valencia lingers on. In an area famous for shipwrecks and watery death, her story stands out from the countless others. Her wreck likely kept many in the area awake at night, wondering if they could have done more. Ghosts are the lives we couldn't save. In 1906, death was closer, especially for those who ventured to the edges of the map. Accidents and disasters were more common. People died young. With so much uncertainty, it's hard not to look out into the fog and wonder, why am I here? When will my time come? Could I have done more? A shape forms in the darkness. Questions pile up unanswered, and the ghosts become real.